Roy Buchanan didn't care about Jeff Beck. That's not entirely accurate. He'd heard the records. Truth, Beck Ola, the Yardbirds years before that. He knew the name the way anyone who played guitar in 1971 knew the name, through magazine covers and radio, and the secondhand enthusiasm of people who'd seen him play in England. He was aware of Jeff Beck the way you're aware of weather in a city you've never visited. But knowing someone's name and respecting them are different things. Roy was playing a bar in Northern Virginia that Thursday night. The name of the place doesn't matter much. It was the kind of room where the ceiling was too low, and the PA was always just slightly broken, and the bartender knew most of the regulars by their first names. 200 people on a good night, sometimes fewer. Roy had been playing rooms like this for years, not because he had to, but because something about these rooms felt honest. No management, no contracts, no cameras pointed at his face. The music moved between the walls and the floor and the people, and when the night was over, it was over, and nobody was writing it down. He was 31 years old and already being called the best unknown guitarist in America. He'd read that somewhere, in a small magazine, a short blurb near the back, and it had sat with him in a way he didn't fully understand. Best unknown, two words that canceled each other out. He was tuning between sets when someone came backstage. Not backstage exactly. There was a narrow hallway between the bar and the storage area, and Roy stood there with a cigarette and his Telecaster in too little space. The someone was a promoter he half knew from D.C., a short man named Harold who always seemed to be slightly out of breath, like he'd been walking faster than necessary his whole life. "Jeff Beck is here," Harold said. Roy didn't look up from the tuning peg. "Okay. He came to see you." "That's nice." Harold waited, as if expecting something more. Roy pulled a slight bend on the G string, listened to it settle. Let the silence do what silence does. "He wants to meet you," Harold said. Roy finally looked up. After the set. The second set started at 10:15. Roy played like he always played, which is to say he played like a man alone in a room, regardless of who was watching. His Telecaster had a crack running along the body that he'd repaired himself, and the neck pickup had been rewired twice, and the whole instrument sounded like something that had been through actual weather. Not a collector's piece. Not something you'd put behind glass. A working tool that had absorbed enough hours to have a personality of its own. He opened with a slow blues in E. Nothing complicated. The kind of thing that sounds simple until you try to play it and realize that simplicity is its own kind of trap. Every note exposed. No distortion to hide behind, no complexity to distract. Just the string and the finger and the space between the notes. Somewhere in the audience, Jeff Beck was watching. Beck had arrived around 9:30 with a friend. No announcement, no entourage. He'd heard about Roy from a session musician in London who'd used the phrase, "You have to see this man," in a way that made Beck curious. Not the usual enthusiasm. Something more careful, like the man was choosing his words. Beck had been in the States for a few weeks, doing press, doing the things that came with being Jeff Beck in 1971, and he'd made the drive down from New York specifically for this. He stood near the back of the room with a beer he wasn't really drinking. He watched Roy's hands. He watched the way Roy stood, still, almost heavy, like he'd planted himself into the floor. Roy didn't look at him once during the set. After the set, Harold brought Beck to the hallway. Roy was already there. Same cigarette, different one. Same Telecaster, leaning against the wall now. Beck put out his hand. "Roy Buchanan." "Jeff Beck." They shook. Roy looked at him the way he looked at most people. Steadily, without particular warmth, without hostility either. Just assessment. The kind of look that doesn't need to become anything else. "I've been wanting to see you play for a while," Beck said. "How was it?" Beck smiled slightly. "I need to sit with it." That was the right answer. Roy didn't smile, but something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly. He offered Beck a cigarette. Beck took it. They stood there for a moment without talking, which should have been awkward but wasn't. The bar noise filtered through the walls. Someone was laughing too loudly near the front. A glass broke somewhere, and then there was a cheer. "I heard you don't record much," Beck said. "Not much." "Why?" Roy took a drag. Studios make you play the same thing twice. Beck looked at him. That's the job. That's a job. Another silence. Beck turned it over. He'd spent the last few years in studios, building sounds layer by layer, chasing something he could sometimes almost hear in his head, but couldn't quite catch on tape. He'd made records he was proud of, beautiful records, and some part of him understood exactly what Roy meant. The difference between capturing something and performing the capture of something, which are not at all the same. "You want to play?" Roy asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, the kind Roy seemed to ask instead of making statements. Beck looked around at the hallway, the cracked plaster, the stack of beer cases, the single bare bulb overhead. "Here." Roy reached behind him and picked up the Telecaster. He held it out. What happened in the next few minutes is hard to reconstruct cleanly because everyone who was there remembers it differently. Harold remembers that Roy handed over the guitar and then crossed his arms and stood back against the wall without a word. A couple of musicians who'd been talking near the exit noticed Beck holding Roy's guitar and went quiet. Not silent, just quieter, the way people get when something shifts in a room and they can feel it before they understand it. Beck held the Telecaster for a moment without playing it. He checked the tuning. He adjusted the strap slightly. He ran his thumb across the strings once, softly, almost tentatively, like he was reading something written there, some history the wood had absorbed. Roy watched him. Then Beck started playing. He didn't play anything recognizable, not one of his own songs, not a standard, not a blues progression Roy might have anticipated. He played something that seemed to have no name, no genre, no clear point of origin. It was slow at first, a single phrase repeated and bent slightly differently each time, like he was asking a question in several languages and waiting to see which one the guitar understood. Roy uncrossed his arms. The phrase expanded. Beck's right hand moved across the strings with a precision that was almost invisible. You couldn't see the effort, which meant the effort had been absorbed somewhere below the surface, years ago, and what remained was just the sound. The Telecaster, Roy's Telecaster, began to do things Roy hadn't asked of it in a long time. Not better things, different things. The same instrument, the same strings, the same crack along the body, and yet, Roy stood perfectly still. He was aware suddenly and with uncomfortable clarity that he was watching someone use his own guitar to say something he hadn't thought to say. Not because Beck was better. It wasn't that clean, that simple. It was because Beck had arrived from somewhere else, heard the instrument fresh, without the accumulated weight of every night Roy had played it, every bar, every set, every long drive home, and found a door Roy had stopped noticing. The playing lasted maybe 4 minutes. When Beck stopped, he didn't look up right away. He kept his eyes on the strings for a moment, like he was reading the last line of something he hadn't expected to find. Then he looked at Roy. Roy said nothing. He reached out and took the guitar back. He turned it over once in his hands, looking at it. The crack along the body, the rewired pickup, the worn-down frets near the 12th position where years of playing had taken something off the metal. "Okay," Roy said. That was all. They talked for another hour, mostly about small things. Specific guitars, specific amplifiers, a long conversation about how the acoustics of different rooms change what you hear when you're playing, how the same note sounds different in a church versus a bar versus someone's living room. At some point, someone brought them both a drink they hadn't ordered. Beck left around midnight. Roy stood in the parking lot afterward for a while, longer than necessary. The air was cold for November, the kind of cold that's clarifying rather than unpleasant. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and didn't think about anything in particular. Except he did. He thought about that phrase Beck had found in his guitar. He thought about how a thing you've held every day can still surprise you. Not because it's changed, but because someone else holds it differently. He thought about the word unknown and what it was starting to mean to him, whether it meant invisible or whether it meant something else. Free, maybe. Unencumbered. Whether that was an honest assessment or just a story he told himself to make the small rooms feel like a choice. He didn't reach a conclusion. He went back inside and helped load out the equipment. Roy Buchanan made his first proper studio album the following year. He never talked publicly about that night in Northern Virginia, at least not directly. But in a 1973 interview with a guitar magazine, a short piece, 2 columns, buried near the back, he was asked about influences, about who he thought was worth watching. He listed a few names, Chicago players mostly, old bluesmen he'd grown up on, and then at the end, almost as an afterthought, Beck knows how to listen to an instrument. Not every player knows the difference. The interviewer didn't follow up on it. The piece ran without much attention. Beck read it. He kept the clipping, tucked into a notebook he carried at the time. He didn't show it to anyone, didn't mention it in interviews. But years later, in a conversation with a journalist who'd asked him about the guitarists he genuinely respected, not admired from a distance, but respected, a different weight to that word, Beck's answer was quiet and brief. Roy Buchanan, he said. I played his guitar once in a hallway in Virginia. He handed it back to me and said, okay, in a way that meant something. I'm still not completely sure I understand. He paused for a moment. That's the highest compliment I've ever been paid. Roy Buchanan died in 1988. He was 48 years old. The music he left behind is the kind that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into a room and ask to be noticed. It waits for you to come to it, and when you finally do, it asks something of you. Some patience, some quiet, some willingness to hear a thing more than once before you start to understand what it's saying. Jeff Beck played until the very end of his own life. He never stopped being the kind of player who could pick up someone else's guitar in a badly lit hallway and find something there that hadn't been found before. Neither of them needed a stage to do what they did. That was the thing they recognized in each other, in that narrow space between the bar and the storage room, with the crowd noise bleeding through the walls and the bare bulb overhead, and nowhere particular to be. Some conversations don't need an audience.